I watched my grandmother clutch her new passport at the airport before my father casually announced her ticket was never booked. She had paid $38,000, yet my parents still boarded the plane without her. 3 weeks later, they returned to find strangers living in the house they thought they had stolen. They had no idea my grandmother and I had already turned them from predators into the prey. I am Lexi Rivera. I am 34 years old, and for the past 8 years, I have worked as a senior compliance analyst at Crescent Ridge Recovery Network. My entire professional life revolves around finding the cracks in the facade. I am trained to spot the discrepancies in a ledger, the nervous twitch in a vendor's eye during an audit, the microscopic details that give away a grand deception. I know exactly what a lie looks like before it even leaves a person's mouth. Yet, nothing in my career could have prepared me for the staggering fraud unfolding right in front of me under the glaring, sterile lights of Capital Piedmont Airport. It was a freezing morning in early December. The air outside the terminal was sharp enough to bite through a wool coat, but inside, it was a different kind of cold. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a blinding white intensity, casting long, harsh shadows across the polished linoleum floor of the departure hall. We were standing near the international check-in desks, a sea of travelers dragging heavy suitcases, but my focus was entirely on my grandmother. Evelyn Hart was 72 years old, and she had dressed for this morning as if she were attending a royal coronation. She wore her best navy blue wool suit, a silk scarf neatly tied around her neck, and a pair of pearl earrings that usually only saw the light of day on Easter Sunday. Her frail hands trembled slightly as she stood by her worn leather suitcase. She kept thumbing through a clear plastic folder containing her brand new passport, her reading glasses, and a neatly printed itinerary. Her eyes, usually tired from decades of working night shifts as a nurse, were wide and sparkling with an innocent, almost childlike excitement. This was supposed to be the dream, the great European vacation, her very first time leaving the country. A few feet away stood my parents, Grant and Monica Rivera. They looked like they belonged in a glossy magazine advertisement for luxury travel. My mother wore a sleek cashmere coat and designer sunglasses pushed up into her perfectly styled hair. My father stood beside her, clad in a tailored blazer, checking his expensive watch for what felt like the 15th time in 5 minutes. They were vibrating with an impatient, polished energy. What struck me most was their absolute refusal to make eye contact with the woman who had birthed my mother. They looked at the departure boards. They looked at the luggage carousel. They looked anywhere but at Evelyn. The line for the baggage drop was moving quickly. My grandmother turned to my father, her voice trembling with a mixture of nerves and pure joy. She asked him if she needed to hand over her passport now or wait until they reached the counter. That was the moment the trap sprang shut. My father sighed, a heavy, performative sound. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, swiping across the screen with exaggerated, frantic motions. He furrowed his brow, shaking his head as if he were encountering an unexpected, tragic technical glitch. He looked up, his face molded into a mask of fake pity. He told her there was a problem. He said her ticket was not in the system. He claimed the booking was never finalized by the airline, and the flight was completely full. He placed a heavy, patronizing hand on her frail shoulder and told her she needed to just go back home, that it was a simple mistake, that they would figure it out later. The sparkling light in my grandmother's eyes shattered instantly. The bustling noise of the airport seemed to fade into a vacuum of silence. She looked down at her polished shoes, her grip tightening on the plastic folder until her knuckles turned white. In a voice so quiet and fragile it broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. She reminded them of the money. She said she had paid $38,000 for this trip. My mother did not even miss a beat. Monica stepped forward, her voice sharp and devoid of a single ounce of empathy. She cut my grandmother off immediately. She said there was simply no time to fix it now, that they would miss their own flight if they stayed to argue, and that they would just have to try again next time. It was a spectacular display of cruelty, delivered casually in the middle of a crowded public space. They were abandoning her. They were taking her life savings and leaving her standing alone in the cold. I felt a familiar, icy calm wash over me. It was the same hyper-focused clarity I felt when an audit revealed a massive embezzlement scheme. The anger was there, burning hot in my chest, but it was perfectly contained. I stepped right between my parents and my grandmother. I did not whisper. I did not try to keep the peace. I projected my voice, making sure it carried over the rumble of rolling suitcases and the chatter of nearby passengers. I said, I am not getting on that plane. I said I'm staying right here with Grandma. The words hit my parents like a physical blow. Grant froze, his hand dropping awkwardly from his phone. Monica opened her mouth to argue, her perfectly painted lips parting in shock, but no sound came out. They stared at me, and in that split second, I saw the exact moment the realization hit them. They realized I was no longer the compliant, quiet daughter they could drag along in their wake. They realized the ground beneath their feet had suddenly shifted. My mother finally found her voice, her tone shifting from dismissive to defensive, demanding to know what I was doing and warning me not to ruin their family trip. I did not answer her. Instead, I just looked at her. I looked right into my mother's eyes with a stare so utterly devoid of warmth that I saw her visibly swallow hard. I held her gaze, my silence screaming louder than any accusation, as they finally turned and walked away toward the security checkpoint, leaving us behind. I pulled my grandmother close to my side. My mother cast one nervous glance back over her shoulder, completely unaware of the truth. She had no idea that I was not just acting out of sudden anger. She had no idea that her perfect, airtight plan was already crumbling, and she had absolutely no idea what I had found sitting on the desk inside her house exactly 10 days ago, 6 weeks before that cold morning at the airport. The stage was set in a dimly lit, overpriced steakhouse in the upscale neighborhood of Westmere. It was my mother's favorite tactic. Monica loved delivering major family news in environments where the dim lighting, mahogany walls, and the quiet clinking of crystal glasses forced everyone into polite compliance. You cannot make a scene when the waiter is pouring a vintage Cabernet right next to your ear. That night, my parents had insisted on treating my grandmother and me to dinner. The moment we sat down, I felt a subtle tension in the air. Grant was adjusting his cuffs too frequently. Monica was overly bright, her smile a little too fixed. After the salads were cleared, she leaned forward, folding her manicured hands on the crisp white tablecloth, and began her presentation. She called it the ultimate family dream trip, 18 days traveling through the most beautiful parts of Portugal, Spain, and Italy. She did not just invite us, she pitched it. She painted vivid pictures of drinking wine on the Amalfi Coast, taking a vintage train through the Spanish countryside, and walking through ancient cathedrals in Rome. She spoke of sunset dinners and cobblestone streets, with the practiced rhythm of a salesperson closing a massive deal. I watched my grandmother across the table. Evelyn sat perfectly still, her hands resting softly in her lap. For 40 years, she had worked grueling night shifts in the crowded wards of the city hospital. Her life had been a continuous cycle of sensible shoes, packed lunches, and saving every extra penny. She had never bought a luxury item for herself. She had never even possessed a passport. As Monica spun this beautiful fantasy of European shores, I saw genuine tears welling up in my grandmother's eyes. Evelyn reached out and touched my mother's hand. She said she would love nothing more than to see the hills of Lisbon before she became too old to walk those steep streets. She was so vulnerable in her joy, so completely trusting of her daughter, but I could not turn off the part of my brain that analyzed risk for a living. The compliance analyst in me started picking up on the micro-expressions, the tiny tells that indicated something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. When my grandmother asked a quiet question about how much she would need to contribute, I saw Monica's knuckles turn white. My mother gripped the delicate stem of her wine glass so tightly, I thought the crystal might shatter in her hand. Her voice went up half an octave as she waved the question away, saying it was going to be an expensive trip, but completely worth it. Then I looked at my father. Grant had suddenly become intensely interested in cutting his medium-rare ribeye steak. He kept his eyes glued to his plate. When he muttered that he had all the logistics completely taken care of, he actively avoided looking in my direction. People who are telling the truth usually look you in the eye to ensure you understand them. People who are lying look away because they fear you will see right through them. I pushed my unease down, telling myself I was being overly cynical. But a few days later, the unease returned and began to fester. I stopped by my grandmother's house after work to help her prune her rose bushes. She was practically glowing with excitement. She made us a pot of Earl Grey tea and cheerfully mentioned that she had just wired the first installment of money to Monica. I froze with my teacup halfway to my mouth. I asked her why she was wiring money so soon. Evelyn smiled her gentle, trusting smile and explained that Monica needed to secure the hotel reservations immediately. My mother had told her that finding ground floor, easily accessible rooms for seniors in historic European hotels was incredibly difficult and required premium deposits. I mentally calculated the cost of a shared family vacation, even for luxury accommodations. The amount Evelyn mentioned seemed absurdly high for just one extra person joining a trip that was supposedly already planned. I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach, but I did not want to ruin her happiness with my baseless suspicions. Exactly 1 week later, the knot in my stomach tightened into a hard, undeniable reality. I was sitting at Evelyn's small kitchen table, sorting through her mail. When she pulled her checkbook from her purse, she hummed a quiet tune as she carefully wrote out a massive second check. I asked her what this one was for. Evelyn did not miss a beat. She repeated my mother's excuses perfectly, clearly having been coached. She said Monica had called to explain that there were sudden additional costs. They needed to purchase premium international travel insurance, hire private cars instead of taking trains so Evelyn would not get tired, and pay for specialized travel medical support fees just in case of an emergency. I stared at the check. The numbers written out in my grandmother's elegant, shaky cursive brought the grand total to exactly $38,000. It was an astronomical sum. It was nearly a year of her retirement savings. I asked her if she was entirely sure about this, my voice tight with suppressed alarm. Evelyn just patted my hand gently. She told me she refused to be a financial burden on her children. She believed with her whole heart that this was her way of contributing her fair share. She thought she was buying her way into a beautiful family memory, ensuring she would not be a nuisance to anyone. She slid the check into an envelope, perfectly content. I sat there, listening to the ticking of the clock on the kitchen wall, feeling a profound sense of dread washing over me. Every instinct I had honed over 8 years of corporate investigations was screaming that this was a shakedown, the vague terminology, the sudden urgency, the emotional manipulation. It was all textbook fraud. As Evelyn turned her back to put the kettle on the stove, I acted on pure, ingrained professional reflex. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket. I slipped the check partially out of the envelope, made sure the lighting was clear, and snapped a high-resolution photograph of the document. The amount, the date, the signature, and the payee line bearing my mother's name were all perfectly captured. I slipped the phone back into my pocket before Evelyn turned around. At that moment, I told myself I was just being paranoid. I told myself it was just my habit of documenting everything. I had no idea that the digital image sitting in my phone gallery would become the cornerstone of my entire case. I did not know it would be the first undeniable piece of evidence in a quiet, ruthless war I was about to wage against my own flesh and blood. The week of Thanksgiving brought the suffocating warmth of family holidays. The smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon filled my parents' sprawling suburban house, acting as a heavy perfume over the rot festering underneath. I was visiting to help with the post-dinner cleanup, playing the role of the dutiful daughter. Monica walked into the kitchen, wiping her hands on a designer towel, and asked me to go into the home office. She needed me to print out a batch of gift labels and a new set of luggage tags for their upcoming trip. I agreed, glad for a moment of quiet away from their forced cheerfulness. I walked down the hall, stepped into the wood-paneled office, and shut the heavy oak door firmly behind me. The expensive laser printer sat on the corner of my father's mahogany desk. I sent the files from the main computer, but the machine merely whirred, clicked loudly, and abruptly jammed. I sighed, opening the side panel to gently pull out a crumpled sheet of blank paper. The moment I closed the tray, the machine reset. It did not print the luggage tags. Instead, it suddenly spat out a thick stack of paper that had been queued up and trapped deep in its memory. I picked up the warm pages. They were not travel documents. They formed a multi-page form bearing the elegant corporate logo of a place called Harbor Pines Residence. Right below the logo, printed in bold black ink, were the words, Resident Intake Form. The name typed neatly into the primary patient field made the breath freeze completely in my lungs. Evelyn Hart. I stood frozen, reading the medical evaluation section printed on the second page. The boxes checked described a frail, incompetent woman I did not recognize at all. The form labeled her as forgetful. It claimed she was prone to wandering. It stated she required daily medication supervision and exhibited severe signs of cognitive decline. It was a complete, malicious fabrication. My grandmother still managed her own retirement portfolio and finished the Sunday crossword puzzle in pen. The words on the page were not a medical assessment. They were a carefully constructed narrative. They were designed specifically to strip a perfectly sane woman of her legal autonomy. I did not scream. I did not storm into the dining room to hurl the papers at my mother. The years I spent building my career in corporate compliance took over instantly. Silencing the shocked daughter and awakening the cold investigator, I placed the pages flat on the polished surface of the desk. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket, double-checked that the camera shutter sound was completely silenced, and photographed every single page. I made absolute sure the margins, the dates, and the signatures were perfectly clear in the frame. Then I hit the cancel button on the printer queue to clear its memory. I grabbed the printed intake forms and slid them to the very bottom of the recycling bin, hiding them under a thick pile of junk mail and old catalogs. I finally printed the harmless luggage tags, pasted a polite smile on my face, and walked back out to the living room as if nothing in the world had changed. That night, sitting in the dark silence of my own apartment, I opened my personal laptop. My parents were notoriously arrogant and terribly lazy with their digital security. For years, we had shared a family cloud storage account, primarily used to swap holiday pictures and recipes. I logged into the server. I bypassed the cheerful albums titled Summer Barbecue and Christmas Morning. I dug deep into the nested administrative folders my father rarely bothered to organize or hide. Buried 3 levels down was a newly created directory. The title was simply January Transition EH. I clicked open the folder. The very first file I found was a highly detailed financial spreadsheet. It was not a budget for a European vacation. It was a ledger of impending absolute ruin. It listed my parents' staggering personal loans, a massive second mortgage they had secretly taken out on their house, and a crushing balloon payment due from my father's failed attempt to expand his commercial heating and cooling business 2 years prior. The absolute deadline for the balloon payment fell exactly in the second week of January. The motive was crushing debt. The weapon was legal authority. Below the spreadsheet sat a collection of draft legal documents. I opened a file titled Durable Power of Attorney. Next to it was a medical healthcare proxy form, a document drafted to grant Monica total, unquestionable control over Evelyn's living arrangements and medical decisions. The final document in the row was an official real estate appraisal of my grandmother's house. The appraisal was dated just 3 days ago. They were not planning to move her into a facility to take care of her health. They were planning to institutionalize her against her will and quickly liquidate her property to save themselves from complete financial destruction. Then I saw the single audio file sitting at the bottom of the list. I put on my noise-canceling headphones and pressed play. It was a recorded phone consultation. The man on the other end introduced himself as a senior placement specialist. His voice was incredibly smooth, deeply professional, and chillingly detached. I heard my mother's voice asking him directly how to handle a stubborn parent who might resist the transition. The consultant advised her to wait until after a major disorienting event. He suggested a long trip or a sudden, drastic change in environment. He told her the physical disorientation makes the elderly far more compliant and confused. He said once they are tired and unsure of their surroundings, you simply put the pen in their hand and tell them it is just standard, required paperwork for their own legal protection. The sheer, calculated evil of the conversation made me physically sick to my stomach. I paused the recording, pulling the headphones down around my neck as I took a deep, shaking breath. I methodically exported every single file, the ruinous spreadsheet, the forged medical assessments, the legal drafts, and the horrifying audio recording. I compressed them all into an encrypted, password-protected archive. I sent the archive directly to my secure personal email server. I copied the same archive onto a physical external solid-state drive that I kept locked in my desk drawer. Finally, I sent the encrypted download link to my fiancé, Caleb Sloan. I attached a brief, urgent message telling him that if anything happened to my access, or if my parents suddenly realized their mistake and wiped the shared drive clean, he was to preserve this link at all absolute costs. The evidence was secured. The trap they had built for my grandmother was now fully documented, and the quiet, methodical hunt to destroy them had officially begun. The drive back from Capital Piedmont Airport was suffocating. The heater in my car was blasting, yet the chill inside the cabin had nothing to do with the freezing December air outside. I kept my eyes fixed on the taillights ahead of me. The rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers, the only sound breaking the heavy, agonizing silence. Beside me, Evelyn sat rigidly in the passenger seat. She was still clutching that clear plastic folder, her fingers pressing so hard against her brand-new passport that her knuckles were entirely white. She stared straight ahead, lost in a paralyzing state of shock, unable to process that the people she loved had just discarded her like a piece of broken luggage. We walked into her house. It smelled of vanilla and old books, a comforting scent that suddenly felt painfully fragile. She took off her coat mechanically and sat down on the edge of the floral sofa. I knew I could not coddle her right now. The protective granddaughter had to step back, and the compliance analyst had to take the lead. I sat down across from her at the heavy oak coffee table and opened my laptop. I did not flood her with everything at once. I started slow. I pulled up the photograph of the second check she had written, the one for the supposed travel insurance and upgrades. I placed my phone on the table. Then, I opened the file containing the Harbor Pines residence intake form. I turned the laptop screen toward her. Evelyn squinted through her reading glasses. She shook her head, a nervous flutter in her voice. She whispered that Monica would never do something like this. She insisted it must be a misunderstanding, a backup plan, something harmless. I gently scrolled down to the medical evaluation section. I watched her read the fabricated descriptions of her own mind. Forgetful, prone to wandering, requires medication supervision. The color drained completely from her face. Then, I opened the spreadsheet detailing my parents' crushing debts, highlighting the massive balloon payment due in the second week of January. Finally, I showed her the draft of the durable power of attorney and the official real estate appraisal of the very house we were sitting in. I pressed play on the audio recording of the placement consultant. The coldly calculating voice of the specialist filled the quiet living room, advising my mother on how to disorient an elderly parent into signing away their life. The denial in Evelyn's eyes slowly fractured, replaced by a devastating clarity. She was watching her own daughter reduce her entire existence to a ledger of liabilities and assets. But there was one final nail to drive in. I needed her to hear it from the source. I pulled out my phone, dialed the main number for Harbor Pines residence, and put it on speaker. When the receptionist answered, my voice shifted effortlessly into the crisp, impatient tone my mother always used with customer service workers. I stated that I was Monica Rivera, calling to confirm the transition logistics for Evelyn Hart. The receptionist was overly cheerful. She thanked me for calling and pulled up the file. She confirmed everything out loud. She stated that the intake was scheduled for the second week of January. She noted that Evelyn's file was flagged as a high-priority admission. Then, she confirmed the receipt of the initial holding deposit, She read the date the wire transfer had cleared. It was the exact same day Evelyn had handed Monica the second massive check. I thanked the receptionist abruptly and ended the call. The silence that followed was absolute. The final piece of the puzzle had snapped into place with a sickening crunch. My parents had not just stolen her money to pay for a luxurious vacation. They had manipulated her into funding her own institutionalization. They used her life savings to pay the deposit on the cage they planned to lock her in, ensuring they could sell her home to cover their own reckless debts. I waited for the tears. I waited for the collapse. I had tissues ready, bracing myself for the heartbreaking sound of a mother grieving the betrayal of her child. The tears never came. Evelyn set her reading glasses carefully on the table. She smoothed the skirt of her navy blue suit. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were no longer those of a vulnerable, discarded woman. They were like chipped flint. She spoke in a voice so terrifyingly calm and measured, it sent a shiver straight down my spine. She said she did not want to retaliate in anger. She said she wanted to do this right, and she wanted to do it all the way to the end. That was the exact moment the victim vanished, and the architect of their ruin was born. We moved to the large dining room table. I grabbed a legal pad and 2 pens. We spent the next 3 hours building a comprehensive timeline. We mapped out every single event, stripping away the emotion and leaving only the cold, hard facts of the fraud. We wrote down the exact dates of the money transfers. We matched them against the creation dates of the intake forms and the real estate appraisal. We charted the duration of their European trip and aligned it perfectly with the rapidly approaching deadline of my father's business debt. We were no longer a grieving family. We were a task force preparing a devastating indictment. By the time the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, our strategy was locked in place. The pain had been completely compartmentalized, transmuted into a razor-sharp weapon. We made our final decisions for the morning. As soon as the sun came up, I was going to hunt down the most ruthless, effective elder law attorney in the entire state, and Evelyn, armed with a terrifying new clarity, was going to audit every single bank account, safety deposit box, and property deed with her name on it. The mourning period was officially over. The execution of their downfall had just begun. The morning air was brittle and gray when we pulled up to a modest brick building in the quiet district of Stonehaven. The brass plaque on the door simply read, Nora Whitfield, Attorney at Law. There was no sprawling glass lobby or intimidating receptionist. Nora operated out of a cramped office lined floor to ceiling with thick legal volumes and overflowing manila folders. She was a woman in her late 50s with sharp features, silver hair pulled into a tight knot, and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She did not offer us warm platitudes or sympathetic sighs. She poured 3 cups of black coffee, sat behind her heavy desk, and asked us to lay out exactly what we had. I slid the thick binder across the desk. It contained every piece of paper, every photograph, and every transcript we had compiled the night before. Nora opened the cover for 45 minutes. The only sound in the room was the turning of pages and the occasional scratch of her fountain pen taking notes. When she finally looked up, her expression was entirely devoid of shock. It was replaced by a cold, professional fury. She told us we were not just looking at a simple case of stolen funds. She leaned forward, tapping a manicured finger against the fabricated medical evaluation. She defined the exact nature of the crime. She called it severe financial exploitation coupled with attempted coercive placement. She explained that the sheer volume of premeditated paperwork elevated this from a family dispute to a highly orchestrated, predatory fraud. Nora immediately pulled a fresh legal pad toward her. She said the first step was to build an impenetrable wall of documentation around Evelyn. She drafted a comprehensive, sworn affidavit. The language was sterile, precise, and utterly devastating. Evelyn swore under penalty of perjury that she had never consented to enter any assisted living facility. She declared she had never authorized the sale, transfer, or appraisal of her primary residence. Most importantly, she legally classified the sum of $38,000 not as a gift, But as funds obtained under deliberately false pretenses, a notary from the office next door was called in, and I watched my grandmother press her pen to the paper. With one steady signature, Evelyn began clawing back the power her own daughter had tried to steal. It was a profound shift in the room. The frightened victim from the airport was gone, replaced by a woman legally arming herself for war. Next, Nora outlined our offensive strategy. She was going to file an immediate, formal report with Adult Protective Services. Alongside that, she drafted a strict preservation of evidence letter to send directly to the legal department of Harbor Pines residents. The document legally mandated them to freeze all records pertaining to my grandmother. They were ordered to preserve every call log, every intake form, and the exact routing details of the holding deposit my parents had paid using the stolen money. To bolster the official state report, I opened my laptop and showed Nora the digital dossier I had built. I had spent the early morning hours applying my corporate compliance training to the family files. I had extracted the hidden metadata from the real estate appraisal, proving exactly what day and time my father had downloaded it. I mapped out a flawless chain of custody for the digital audio recording of the placement consultant. Cross-referencing it with the bank transfer dates, I handed Nora a timeline so deeply fortified with undeniable technical proof that no opposing lawyer could ever claim the documents were taken out of context. The paperwork was airtight. Nora was thoroughly impressed, but as she clicked through the exported email archive I had provided, she suddenly stopped. Her eyes narrowed at a buried thread I had overlooked in my initial sweep. It was an automated confirmation message from a commercial estate liquidator. Nora read the text aloud, and the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. 3 days before they had abandoned Evelyn at the airport, Monica had requested an expedited estimate for a complete senior home clearance at the exact address of my grandmother. She had specifically asked the company how fast they could empty the property and stage it for a rapid cash sale while the owner was away in a medical transition period. They had intended to have her house gutted and put on the market before she even knew what hit her. The sheer cruelty of the email triggered an immediate, aggressive response from Nora. She did not hesitate. Within 20 minutes, she had drafted 3 separate, blistering legal warnings. The first went straight to the estate liquidator, threatening severe legal consequences if they set foot on the property. The second went to the bank my grandmother used, placing a hard fraud alert on all accounts and blocking any external attempts to establish a power of attorney. The third was dispatched to the largest title company in the county, throwing a massive red flag over the deed to the house to paralyze any secret attempt my parents might make to sell it from overseas. We were just finishing the final signatures when the heavy black telephone on the desk rang. Nora picked it up, listened for a moment, and her sharp eyes flicked toward us. She put the call on speakerphone. It was a man identifying himself as Marcus Bell, a senior investigator with Adult Protective Services. He had just received the expedited digital file Nora had sent over an hour ago. His voice was grim and strictly business. He stated that he reviewed dozens of elder abuse claims every single week, but he rarely saw a case file so completely saturated with undeniable, premeditated evidence. He did not ask for a preliminary review. He did not tell us it would take weeks to process. He said the warning signs were blindingly clear, and the threat level was active. He told Nora he was formally opening an investigation immediately and scheduled an in-person interview with Evelyn at her home in exactly 24 hours. The trap my parents had so carefully designed was now officially snapping shut around their own ankles, following the interview with the investigator from Adult Protective Services. The atmosphere in the house shifted entirely. The defensive walls were up, but Evelyn was not satisfied with merely hiding behind them. We were sitting in the kitchen drinking tea when she made a move I completely did not expect. She set her cup down and announced she was going to sell the house. Not next year, not next month, right now. She wanted the property gone before Monica and Grant ever set foot back on American soil. She knew that as long as she stayed in that house, her daughter would eventually come knocking, armed with fake tears and aggressive manipulation. Selling it was the ultimate severance of their control. Evelyn did not want to list it publicly and deal with months of open houses and real estate agents. She knew exactly who she wanted to sell it to, about 12 months prior. A young couple named Rowan and Elise Mercer had knocked on her door. They had been renting down the street and desperately wanted to buy a home in the neighborhood to raise their 2 toddlers near the parents of Elise. Evelyn had kept their handwritten letter tucked in a kitchen drawer. I called the number on the note that afternoon. The Mercers came over the very next day. Evelyn offered them a private, unlisted sale. She named a price slightly below the current market value, but with 2 absolute conditions attached. The transaction had to be completed entirely in cash, and the closing process had to be finalized in less than 14 days. The Mercers were thrilled. They agreed instantly. For Evelyn, giving up a fraction of the maximum profit was a very small price to pay for absolute speed and ironclad certainty. The following week was a blur of cardboard boxes and packing tape. Stripping down a home of 40 years was a grueling process, hovering constantly between deep emotional pain and a strange, cleansing liberation. I took time off work to help her sort through decades of accumulated life. We were ruthless in our categorizing. Evelyn kept the irreplaceable items. We carefully wrapped the heavy brass mantel clock my grandfather had wound every Sunday. We packed the handmade quilts, the thick albums of family photographs, and a few pieces of antique furniture that held real memories. Everything else was either donated to local charities or handed over to a rapid estate liquidator we had vetted through Nora Whitfield. Watching the dining room table where Monica had announced her fraudulent European dream trip being carried out the front door felt like exhaling a breath I had been holding for years. With the cash from the Mercers safely secured in escrow, Evelyn purchased her new sanctuary. We found a charming sunlit cottage in a 55 and older community called Willow Creek Gardens. Located just 10 minutes from my apartment, it was exactly what my grandmother deserved. The community had a secured entrance with a 24-hour guard gate, ensuring no unwanted family members could ever simply show up at her doorstep. It featured a sprawling clubhouse, vibrant community gardens, and weekly craft classes. As we unpacked her favorite teacups in her new, bright kitchen, I saw the heavy weight of the past few weeks finally lift from her shoulders. She was safe, and for the first time in a long time, she was entirely in control of her own environment. Nora executed the financial restructuring with military precision. She took the remaining bulk of the house sale funds and placed them directly into an irrevocable trust, permanently shielding the money from any future legal attacks or manipulative schemes my parents might attempt. But Nora also did something brilliantly petty, perfectly aligned with our new reality. She opened a completely separate, highly visible banking account under the name of Evelyn. She officially titled it the Restitution Reserve Account. It was currently empty, waiting specifically to hold the exact amount of $38,000, plus legal fees, that my parents would be forced to return. It was a digital monument to their impending debt. On our 3rd night in the new cottage, Evelyn handed me a printed confirmation receipt. I looked at the paper, fully expecting another legal document, but it was a travel itinerary. She had quietly used a small fraction of her own secured funds to book a domestic coastal retreat with a local senior women travel group. They were going to spend 8 days exploring historic lighthouses and eating fresh seafood along the eastern seaboard. I looked up at her, my eyes tearing up despite my best efforts to stay professional. She smiled softly and told me she wanted to go on a trip using money she had chosen to spend, entirely on her own terms. She refused to let the money they used to lead her by the nose dictate her relationship with travel. She was reclaiming her joy. The timing could not have been more perfect. 2 days before Grant and Monica were scheduled to fly back from their luxurious vacation, the final closing documents for the old house were signed and officially recorded with the county. The heavy brass keys were handed over to Rowan and Elise Mercer. The title was legally transferred. The new address at Willow Creek Gardens was strictly protected under attorney-client privilege and heavily redacted from all public filings. We had effectively erased her physical footprint. By the time my parents boarded their return flight, expecting to come home and bully a confused, vulnerable old woman into signing away her life, they had no idea she was already gone. Everything was locked down. From that moment forward, any attempt to reach Evelyn Hart had to go through a very aggressive lawyer. The board was set, the pieces had moved, and the trap was perfectly primed. While my parents were halfway across the globe, the digital performance began. My mother started flooding her social media feeds with perfectly curated photographs. There were images of her holding oversized glasses of deep red wine against the backdrop of the Amalfi coastline. There were staged, candid shots of my father smiling on a sunlit balcony overlooking a historic piazza. The captions were what made my stomach turn. She repeatedly used the phrase, family healing trip, writing long, emotional paragraphs about taking time to reconnect and find peace. The sheer audacity of it was staggering. She was broadcasting a narrative of spiritual renewal, while the woman who had funded the entire charade was supposed to be sitting alone, abandoned in a cold airport terminal, waiting to be institutionalized. My father was less interested in performing for the public and more focused on maintaining his grip on his target. Grant called Evelyn 3 different times during their second week abroad. His voice dripped with a sickening, manufactured concern. He would ask how her joints were feeling in the winter chill and casually inquire if she had signed those estate planning forms he had left on the kitchen counter. Per the strict instructions from our lawyer, Nora Whitfield, we routed every single call through a recording application. Evelyn sat at her new dining table in the Willow Creek cottage, her posture rigid, delivering the exact neutral responses Nora had scripted. She offered no extra information. She simply said she was resting and that she would look at the paperwork eventually. The absolute lack of panic in my grandmother's voice clearly unsettled him, but he kept up the facade of the devoted son. They were growing anxious, and that anxiety bred carelessness. Late one Tuesday evening, an urgent fraud alert pinged on my laptop. It was a notification from the bank where Evelyn held her primary checking account. Someone had attempted a remote login. I dug into the security log and traced the device signature. It was an old tablet my grandmother had previously used and left at my parents' house months ago. My mother was sitting in a luxury hotel room in Europe, sipping espresso, and actively trying to breach her own mother's financial accounts to monitor the balance. It was a desperate attempt to maintain control from afar, and it gave us another undeniable piece of digital evidence proving their intent. Their desperation escalated rapidly. The following afternoon, a marked patrol car pulled up to the security gate at Willow Creek Gardens. A local police officer knocked on the door of the cottage, looking deeply apologetic. He explained that a concerned daughter had called from overseas to request an emergency wellness check. Monica had told the dispatcher that her mother was suffering from severe age-related paranoia, that she was prone to wandering, and that she might be in immediate physical danger. The officer sat in the sunlit living room, drank a cup of herbal tea, and had a 30-minute conversation with Evelyn about classic literature and the current state of local politics. He left completely satisfied that she was perfectly lucid and safe. More importantly, Nora immediately obtained the police report and forwarded it to Adult Protective Services. Monica thought she was building a paper trail of dementia to justify the upcoming forced placement. Instead, she had just handed the state investigator documented proof of her attempts to fabricate a medical crisis. Nora was playing a masterful game of legal chess. She drafted a formal demand letter to the corporate office of Harbor Pines residents, insisting on the immediate refund of the holding deposit, but she included a specific, lethal caveat. The facility was legally required to return the funds directly to the original account that issued the payment. 2 days later, a highly detailed transaction receipt arrived at Nora's office. It showed that the substantial deposit for the memory care facility had not come from any of Evelyn's accounts. It had been wired directly from the joint checking account belonging to Grant and Monica Rivera, completely bypassing the travel insurance excuse. They had deposited her $38,000 and immediately turned around and used their own account to secure her institutional prison. The financial loop was closed, and their guilt was permanently etched into the banking ledger. Despite the mountain of evidence, I found myself battling a crushing emotional exhaustion. I was angry, but beneath the rage was a profound, lingering grief. These were the people who had raised me. I sat on the couch in my apartment, staring blankly at the wall, feeling the immense weight of the destruction we were about to unleash. My fiancé, Caleb, sat down beside me and took my hand. He listened quietly as I confessed my guilt over tearing my family apart. Caleb looked at me with a steady, grounding calmness. He reminded me that I was not the one destroying anything. He said my parents had made their choices the moment they left her at the airport. He told me that protecting a vulnerable person does not mean seeking vengeance. It simply means exposing the truth and letting the consequences fall exactly where they belong. His words anchored me, pulling me back from the edge of my own doubt. The final pieces of the counteroffensive were locking into place perfectly on schedule. Later that week, I received a text message from a sweet elderly neighbor who lived right across the street from Evelyn's old house. She was highly confused and reported that strangers had been walking around the property taking exterior photographs while my parents were still away. I smiled for the first time in days. It was not a break-in. It was the commercial title inspector finalizing the closing documents for Rowan and Elise Mercer. The sale was moving forward flawlessly. The house was no longer a piece of leverage my parents could use to clear their crippling debts. It belonged to a young family now, and my parents had absolutely no idea. The trap was fully loaded. I sat in the austere office of our attorney, watching the winter sun cast long shadows across the floor. Nora folded her hands on the heavy mahogany desk and looked at the large calendar hanging on the wall. She circled a date in bold red ink. It was the exact day my parents' flight was scheduled to touch down on American soil. She looked at me, her eyes sharp and unyielding. She said the day they pull up to that curb and see total strangers living in the house they thought they owned will be a profound shock. But she leaned forward, her voice dropping into a register of pure, legal menace. She promised me that the moment they saw those strangers would only be the opening act, not the finale. Exactly 3 weeks after the morning at Capital Piedmont Airport, my parents' flight touched down on American soil. I knew the exact minute their plane landed because I had been tracking the flight number. They did not even bother going to their own home first. Driven by a toxic mixture of arrogance and a desperate need to finalize their financial rescue plan, they dragged their heavy, expensive suitcases straight from the airport terminal to my grandmother's property. They arrived with the firm expectation of finding a broken, terrified old woman who would be so desperate for their manufactured affection that she would sign any legal document shoved in front of her. Instead of the quiet, vulnerable target they anticipated, they walked into a scene that completely shattered their reality. As their town car pulled up to the curb, they saw a massive moving truck parked in the driveway. The heavy oak front door was propped wide open. A young man was carrying a bright yellow velvet armchair up the front steps. Festive string lights were being draped across the porch railing, and a pair of brightly colored plastic tricycles were parked haphazardly on the front lawn. The house did not look abandoned. It looked incredibly alive, vibrating with the chaotic energy of a completely new family settling in. My mother marched up the walkway, her designer heels clicking sharply against the concrete. She bypassed the young man and marched straight up to the open doorway. Her face twisted in a mask of entitled rage. She pounded her fist against the doorframe, demanding to know what was going on. Elise Mercer stepped into the foyer, wiping dust from her hands onto her jeans. Monica immediately started screaming, her voice shrill and echoing down the quiet suburban street. She yelled that this was her family property and demanded the intruders vacate the premises immediately. Elise did not flinch. She was a woman who had just signed a mountain of paperwork and handed over a massive cashier's check. She possessed the unshakable confidence of a legal homeowner. Elise crossed her arms and calmly informed my mother that she and her husband were the rightful owners. She stated that the sale had fully closed days ago. The deed was recorded, and the keys were theirs. When Monica continued to shriek threats of calling the police, Elise simply stepped back, advised my mother to contact a real estate lawyer or the county title office, and firmly shut the heavy oak door right in her face. The sound of that door clicking shut must have sounded like a judge slamming a gavel. My phone rang 2 minutes later, I was sitting at my kitchen island, a hot cup of coffee in my hands, waiting for it. I answered on the first ring, putting the call on speakerphone so Caleb could hear. My father's voice burst through the speaker. He was breathless, straddling the line between blind panic and pure, unadulterated rage. He screamed into the receiver, asking who these strangers were living in our house. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I let his heavy breathing fill the silence for a long moment. Then, in a voice completely stripped of any daughterly affection, I delivered the reality check. I told him it was not their house. I told him it was never their house. From the very beginning to the very end, it was my grandmother's house, and she had every right to liquidate her own asset. Grant sputtered, completely incapable of processing the loss of his massive financial parachute. I did not give him time to recover. I informed him that Evelyn had relocated to a highly secure community. I told him she had zero desire to see them, speak to them, or entertain their fake apologies. I made it absolutely clear that from this second forward, every single piece of communication had to be routed directly through her retained legal counsel, Nora Whitfield. I heard my mother snatch the phone from his hand. Monica was practically hissing through the speaker. She instantly resorted to her favorite defense mechanism, deflecting the blame. She accused me of brainwashing a sick old woman. She claimed I was a vindictive, jealous daughter who had manipulated a fragile mind just to ruin their lives. I let her rant. I knew something she did not. I knew exactly who was pulling up to the curb right behind them. While Monica was screaming into the phone, a plain white sedan parked silently behind their hired car. A tall man in a generic gray suit stepped out holding a thick, manila envelope. I heard the entire exchange through the open phone line. The man approached my parents as they stood bewildered on the sidewalk. He asked if they were Grant and Monica Rivera. My father, distracted and furious, barked a confirmation. The man handed the heavy envelope directly to my father and loudly announced that they had been officially served. I ended the call right then. I did not need to hear the rest. I already knew exactly what was inside that envelope. Nora had packed it with a lethal combination of legal nightmares. There was a strict preservation of evidence demand, legally binding them to keep every text, email, and bank statement intact. There was a preliminary civil notice outlining the impending lawsuit for financial exploitation and the immediate return of the $38,000, but the most terrifying document in that stack was the mandatory interview summons from Adult Protective Services. Standing there on the pavement, holding the thick stack of legal demands, the full weight of their actions finally crushed my father. Grant was a businessman, and he understood a paper trail. In that terrifying moment, he realized that every single sunlit photograph Monica had posted from the Amalfi Coast, every luxury dinner receipt, and the exact timestamps of their international flight had just mutated. They were no longer souvenirs of a lavish vacation. They were now meticulously documented, time-stamped evidence of gross elder abandonment. The vacation they had funded with stolen money was the exact weapon that was going to destroy them in a court of law. The contrast of that moment was poetic in its absolute justice. Inside the warm, brightly lit house, the Mercer children were laughing, their small footsteps echoing down the hallway as they explored their new bedrooms. Outside, standing on the cold concrete walkway she had arrogantly assumed would soon be her personal real estate triumph. My mother was completely paralyzed. The suitcases she had dragged across Europe were sitting heavily at her feet. She was locked out of the house, locked out of her mother's life, and staring straight down the barrel of a devastating legal war she had completely brought upon herself. The financial hemorrhage from their failed schemes and crushing debts meant my parents could no longer afford top-tier legal representation. They hired a discount litigator operating out of a strip mall, a man who immediately filed a highly aggressive but incredibly sloppy counterclaim. The argument was predictable and insulting. They formally accused me of undue influence. They submitted documents alleging I had manipulated a mentally declining senior citizen into hastily liquidating her estate while she was emotionally unstable. They tried to paint me as a greedy, vindictive granddaughter who was isolating a fragile woman from her loving family simply to secure an early inheritance. Nora Whitfield did not just swat their claim away, She absolutely obliterated it with a mountain of irrefutable paper. She responded with a devastating packet of evidence that left their cheap lawyer stammering. Nora included a comprehensive cognitive evaluation performed by a board-certified geriatric psychiatrist just 2 days after the airport abandonment. The report scored my grandmother flawlessly, noting her exceptional lucidity and sharp memory. Alongside the medical report was a crystal-clear video affidavit. In it, Evelyn looked directly into the camera lens, calmly and forcefully explaining exactly why she had sold the property of her own free will. Nora then attached our meticulously documented timeline, the unassailable cash closing papers, and the damning call logs she had successfully subpoenaed directly from Harbor Pines residents. The walls were rapidly closing in, and the intense pressure completely shattered my parents' united front. Adult Protective Services brought them in for mandatory, separate interviews with investigator Marcus Bell, without the ability to sit in the same room and rehearse their lies. Their fabricated stories violently collided. Marcus asked Grant exactly who had initiated the memory care booking. Grant immediately pointed the finger at Monica, claiming he was just following his wife's lead. When Marcus asked Monica who spun the cruel lie about the unbooked ticket at the terminal, she hysterically blamed Grant, saying he was in charge of all the travel logistics. When pressed hard on where the massive cash transfer had actually gone, they both stammered and offered wildly conflicting timelines. The glaring, documented discrepancies in their sworn testimonies handed the state investigator everything he needed to solidify the financial exploitation charges against both of them. The real breaking point hit when the absolute deadline for my father's massive commercial loan finally came due. With the house sold to strangers and the $38,000 frozen under strict legal scrutiny, he had absolutely no safety net left to catch his falling business. The blind panic stripped away every ounce of his polished, country club veneer. During a highly public meltdown in the asphalt parking lot of their discount lawyer's office, Grant completely turned on his wife. Witnesses heard him screaming that she had pushed the entire fraudulent scheme way too far. He blamed her arrogant greed and her stupid European vacation idea for destroying his only business survival plan. The pristine, magazine-perfect marriage they had broadcasted across social media just weeks prior was now visibly and loudly fracturing in broad daylight. Desperation makes manipulative people incredibly predictable, realizing the legal route was failing. Monica tried to bypass the blockade entirely. She started sending emotionally charged, handwritten letters directly to the Willow Creek cottage. She wrote pages about cherished childhood memories, claimed she had started intense psychological therapy to address her mistakes, and begged for a single chance to heal their broken family. But Nora intercepted every single envelope before Evelyn could even see them. The lawyer pointed out the blatant, toxic pattern to me. Buried right in the middle of every tearful, dramatic apology was a desperate plea to just sit down alone and discuss the financial misunderstandings to avoid a public court battle. It was never truly about making amends. It was always, exclusively, about saving the money. We met in a sterile, windowless conference room for the mandatory pre-mediation settlement discussion. My parents sat across the heavy wooden table, looking a decade older. Their expensive European tans were completely washed out by the harsh fluorescent lights and profound stress. Nora slid a single sheet of printed paper across the polished mahogany. She did not negotiate. She dictated. The demands were absolute and ruinous. We demanded the immediate, full return of the original $38,000. We demanded the full reimbursement of the facility deposit they had made using stolen funds. We added a substantial figure for severe emotional distress and demanded the complete coverage of all our mounting attorney fees. When Monica saw the final total sum printed at the bottom of the page, all the blood drained rapidly from her face. It was a number that would ensure their complete bankruptcy. Then came the move that sealed their fate entirely. In a cowardly, last-ditch attempt to save his own skin and shift the criminal liability entirely onto my mother, Grant made a fatal miscalculation. He instructed his lawyer to submit an audio file into evidence, a saved voicemail Monica had left on his phone weeks before the trip. He truly thought it would prove she was the sole mastermind and he was just an innocent bystander. Instead, the recording played loudly in the dead silent conference room. My mother's voice echoed sharply, laying out the exact, malicious strategy. She explicitly stated over the phone that they needed to leave the old woman at the airport, so she would be thoroughly humiliated, exhausted, and broken down, making her much easier to pressure into signing the power of attorney papers once they dragged her back home. Grant thought he was throwing his wife under the bus, but by admitting he received, listened to, and kept the recording while still actively executing the cruel plan at the airport, he legally crucified them both. The intent to abuse was no longer a theory or an allegation. It was a recorded, undeniable confession. I looked at the defeated, silent shells of my parents across the table and felt a grim sense of total finality. As we packed up our briefcases to leave the facility, I told Nora I would handle all the speaking at the final, formal mediation session scheduled for the following week. But when I returned to the secure cottage and briefed Evelyn on the devastating voicemail twist, she slowly shook her head. She set her porcelain teacup down on the saucer with a quiet, firm clink. She looked at me with a profound, terrifying strength I had never seen in her before. She told me my job as her shield was officially done. She announced she was going to attend the final session in person. She did not want me or the lawyer speaking for her anymore. She wanted to sit across from her own daughter, look her directly in the eye, and be the one to permanently close this dark chapter. She was finally ready to set the absolute new rules of her life. And she was going to deliver the final, crushing blow herself. The mediation took place on a Tuesday morning in a rented, neutral conference room downtown. The air conditioning hummed loudly, doing nothing to cut the suffocating tension. It felt exactly like a courtroom, even though there was no judge present. Sitting on our side of the long mahogany table was Nora Whitfield, my grandmother Evelyn, and myself. Directly across from us sat my parents, Grant and Monica, flanking their discount attorney. At the head of the table sat Marcus Bell, the investigator from Adult Protective Services, serving as an official state observer. My mother tried to seize control of the narrative the second we sat down. She pulled a tissue from her designer purse, her eyes already swimming with practiced tears. She reached her hand across the polished wood and choked out a sob, claiming that they had simply panicked under the weight of their debts and made a terrible, desperate mistake. Evelyn did not reach back. She sat perfectly straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her voice cut through the room like a steel blade. She told Monica to stop hiding behind vague excuses. She demanded that her daughter look her in the eye and use the correct words for what she had done. Evelyn listed them out, her tone uncompromising. She called it stealing her life savings. She called it fabricating medical records to declare her incompetent. She called it a calculated plot to strip away her basic human right to live freely in her own home. The absolute authority in my grandmother's voice forced Monica to shrink back into her leather chair in stunned silence. That was my cue. I did not speak with anger. I spoke with the icy precision of a senior compliance analyst delivering a fatal audit. I opened my thick binder and laid the copies out on the table one by one. I presented the photographs of the forged checks. I placed the Harbor Pines intake form detailing a fake dementia diagnosis right next to the recent, flawless cognitive evaluation. I slid over the digital logs proving their attempt to breach her bank account from Europe. I placed the real estate appraisal on top. Finally, I set down the transcript of the damning voicemail where my mother explicitly detailed her plan to break Evelyn down at the airport. I locked every single piece of evidence to a specific date and time on our master timeline. There was no room for debate. The story was completely airtight. The opposing lawyer tried to weakly suggest that this was all circumstantial family drama. Marcus Bell leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. The investigator was completely unamused. He stated, for the official record, that the evidence presented was more than sufficient to establish severe financial exploitation and attempted fraud. He looked directly at my parents' lawyer and calmly explained that if a comprehensive and entirely satisfactory agreement was not signed in this room today, His next step would be walking the entire file over to the district attorney to seek criminal prosecution. That single sentence sucked the remaining air right out of the room. The opposing attorney immediately dropped his pen, turned to my parents, and told them to agree to whatever we wanted. Nora took over, sliding the final settlement agreement forward. The terms were brutal and non-negotiable. Grant and Monica were legally bound to repay the entire $38,000, plus the stolen facility deposit, plus a substantial sum for emotional damages and every single cent of our legal fees. We established a rigid, monthly payment schedule. Nora included a draconian acceleration clause, meaning if they missed a single payment by even one day, the entire remaining balance would instantly become due, and we would immediately place liens on whatever remaining assets they had. Furthermore, a strict boundary was established regarding any financial or legal matters. They were legally barred from ever asking Evelyn for money or presenting her with any document to sign. If they needed to communicate about the debt, they had to call Nora before they picked up their pens to sign their own financial ruin. Evelyn delivered the final blow. It was a profound moral twist that left them entirely broken. She looked at the two people she had raised and told them she was not promising them forgiveness. She made it crystal clear that things would never go back to the way they were before that morning at the airport. She offered them exactly one very narrow path forward. She said if they ever wanted the privilege of being considered family again, they first had to spend the next several years behaving like responsible, accountable adults. They had to pay back every stolen cent and earn their redemption in silence. She pushed the contract toward them. They signed it with trembling hands. I drove Evelyn back to the Willow Creek Gardens community that afternoon. The heavy, dark cloud that had hung over our family for months finally broke. A few months later, I walked into her sunlit cottage to find her hosting a small afternoon tea party with 3 new friends she had met at a community gardening class. The sound of their genuine laughter filled the room. Hanging on the wall above her dining table was a beautiful framed photograph from her coastal trip. It was a picture of a historic lighthouse standing tall against the crashing ocean waves. Her new life was not filled with flashy European vacations or fake prestige. It was filled with quiet dignity, safety, and absolute, undeniable freedom. As I watched her pour tea, smiling with genuine joy, I realized a hard truth that I need to share with everyone listening across America. Elder abuse does not always look like physical violence. It does not always happen in dark alleys. Sometimes, it wears a tailored suit. Sometimes, it speaks in a gentle, caring voice. Often, it begins with the seemingly helpful phrase, "Let me handle this for you." That is why you have to pay attention. You have to check the documents, keep meticulous records, speak up when things do not make sense, and protect the elderly people in your life before the trap snaps shut. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. Please drop a comment below and let me know where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. And I invite you to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.